Not too long ago, I made a video about why Swedes think Norwegian sounds silly, in which I basically just used my experience of being Swedish and talking to other Swedes about how they feel about Norwegian. I tried to form some hypotheses about why people seem to think this, with most of it coming down to a silly valley effect, where a language is similar enough for you to understand most of it, but has clear differences that you can't help but notice and that make the language sound a little off, maybe even a little bit funny. Now, this video was meant in good humour and wasn't supposed to be taken too seriously. I love Swedish, of course I do, it's my native language, but I also love Norwegian. I hope you all appreciate that I'm laughing about it from a place of love. And yes, I love Danish too. You won't hear a Swede say it often, so savour it, I think your language is great. But this video isn't about you, it's about Swedes and Norwegians. And when Norwegians started commenting on that video about their own stereotypes around Swedish, I thought that was great. I fully expected that Norwegians would think the exact same things about Swedish as Swedes do about Norwegian. It only makes sense considering the silly valley hypothesis that silly valley should go both ways, and we can good-humouredly laugh at each other a little bit. At first, the only thing I really thought about was the number of people complaining that their dialect wasn't represented in the video, that the video is focusing on certain dialects like the standard Norwegian spoken in Oslo or the Trøndersk dialect, which I think was unfair. The northern and western dialects of Norwegian sound considerably different, and I should have emphasised that a lot of conceptions Swedes have about Norwegian come from the dialects of regions that are A, geographically closer to the big Swedish population centres, and B, overrepresented in Norwegian media that then gets shown on Swedish TV. But then, something else started to grab my attention. When the Norwegians made fun of Swedish, they used certain words. Words I hadn't even thought about before as possible descriptors of a language, but they came up time and time again. And that just made me think, I didn't actually have any data to go off in my last video. I just went off on my own ideas and those of the people I grew up around, and those ideas largely seemed to resonate with Swedes who saw the video, but what if I was missing a fuller picture? What if people of different dialects think about Norwegian differently? And crucially, what if what Norwegians think about Swedish isn't just an exact copy of what Swedes think about Norwegian? I needed a relatively broad collection of data with a large sample size. I needed fluent, and especially native, speakers, lots and lots of them. The thing is, to get these kinds of linguistic intuitions and cultural understandings associated with a language, you need to engage with real speakers, not just textbooks. But not everyone has access to an in-person language school with an array of native or native-level teachers to give them that, which is why this video is sponsored by italki, an online hub where teachers and learners can meet, allowing you to learn anytime, anywhere. italki lets students connect with over 30,000 teachers worldwide, with filtering options to find your ideal teacher, for instance one who can also speak your native language. This will allow you to improve your listening and speaking skills, confidence and cultural awareness through conversation practice with native speakers, all while working to meet your individual needs and goals by giving you one-on-one personalized lessons.
And from tahun we can say ulang tahun, birthday. Repeat year, birthday. And if you put salamat in the front, it becomes happy birthday.
And I learned a lot, so thanks to Teddy. Learning options are flexible and convenient. You can book your lessons around your busy schedule and pay per lesson. No subscription needed. Also enjoy 3 refundable trial lessons. And if you click through the link below in the description, you can also buy $10, get $5 free for your first lesson using my exclusive promo code. The discounts are only available to the first 50 users, so make sure to start your language learning journey with italki today. So, lots of native speakers. The best way to collect that kind of data is through a survey. In this case, an online survey. So I started writing a survey in Swedish about how people view Norwegian. Now, I'm an emigrant from Sweden. My writing is okay, but I didn't go to Swedish school or anything, and most importantly, I know what's grammatically correct Swedish and what isn't, but I don't intuitively know what a Swedish survey is supposed to look like. It's the exact kind of formal and procedural writing I very rarely do in that language. After 1.5 years of living in Germany, I filled out more ridiculously long and tedious forms in German than I have ever filled out in my entire life in English or Swedish. In short, the questions were grammatically correct, but perhaps not quite right for survey questions, and in some places a little weird or awkward. It also turns out that phrasing questions in a survey is actually pretty hard regardless of language. I did run the survey past a couple of other Swedish native speakers and they didn't see any issues with it, but some more nitpicky survey takers soon found some. There were a few typographical errors like capitalizing dialect names or forgetting to write in brackets. That last one isn't Swedish specific, I just forgot to write in brackets, that I fixed as the survey went on, but I didn't want to tinker with the phrasing of questions mid-study, and they were clearly fully comprehensible and grammatically okay and so on. So at the end of the day, I ended up with a survey that I'm not fully happy with from an aesthetic point of view, but which was ultimately fully comprehensible and usable, and therefore I'm not going to talk any more about those kinds of issues in this video. Instead, let's talk about the questions from a methodological perspective. Now, you might think methodology is boring, so I made a very rough translation of the form into bokmål, one of Norwegian's 2 written standards, and then had it corrected, i.e. properly translated by a native Norwegian speaker, Ingrid. Thanks, Ingrid. Another native speaker, Johannes, then took that form and translated, converted, changed it into nynorsk, the other official written standard, for a total of 3 versions of this form. Thanks, Johannes. The Norwegian versions obviously had the opposite questions, asking about Swedish rather than about Norwegian, and had the additional question at the start of choosing which standard, or mål, to answer in. This opens up a number of questions, I think. The first of which is, why not have one form and just do it in English? Well, firstly, I wanted a sort of barrier to entry, although the form isn't difficult enough to exclude all non-fluent speakers. The fact that it is in Swedish or Norwegian acts as a reminder of who the form is for, and makes answering the form more effort than it's worth for those who aren't fluent. Combined with the fact that this is a YouTube survey that comes with no reward or incentive to fill out beyond contributing to the results in and of itself, I'll pretty confidently say that almost everyone, if not every single person who filled out this form, is a native level, or fluent speaker of their language. Secondly, I decided to prioritize the native speakers, who were the majority of respondents, over fluent speakers. Right, Scandinavians are very good at English, but it's not like they have no issues with it. For instance, in this study, over a third of Swedish students reported difficulties reading English course literature at university, and over half reported it giving them stress and anxiety, whilst a quarter of Swedish students in upper secondary school also reported difficulties. Again, this shows impressive English abilities overall, but when trying to get qualitative data, as I am in my study, where I want to encourage people to write their own descriptions of the other language, I want as many participants as possible to feel as comfortable as possible. The second question this opens up is, what's going on with Norwegian? Basically, Norwegian has 2 written standards / language varieties which are of equal standing. Bokmål descends from what was basically a Norwegianized version of the Danish written language, while nynorsk is based on a written language created by this guy, which is meant to better reflect the Norwegian language by, actually being created to do that. It's decreasing in usage. Bokmål is used much more and increasingly more commonly. In 2024, according to the Norwegian Statistics Bureau, only 11.2% of elementary school pupils used nynorsk as their main written language, down from nearly 18% in 1992. So, in my opinion, support for both is important, even in silly little surveys like this one. Now, these are written languages, but sometimes people, including some Norwegians, will refer to speaking bokmål or even speaking nynorsk. In my experience, what this actually means varies by dialect and by individual, but spoken bokmål often refers specifically to the Oslo region's urban East Norwegian, which is influenced by Danish and Dano-Norwegian. Spoken nynorsk is an even more confusing term, but I've heard a Norwegian use this term to talk about the western dialects, spoken in Bergen, Stavanger, and the surrounding areas. These dialects can vary a lot, but are grouped into West Norwegian. Sometimes this also includes the southern dialects, like what's spoken in Arendal, but when I asked what dialect people spoke in the survey, I decided to separate these out. Then I also gave East Norwegian brackets except Urban East its own category and included the dialect groups of Trøndersk and North Norwegian. And remember to always throw an other option in there too. In the Swedish survey, I divided the dialects into Central Standard, that's the modern standardized dialect of the Stockholm-Uppsala region, Svealand dialects brackets except Central Standard, that's the traditional dialects of the region, including the old dialect that I would call Stockholmska or Stockholmish, though in the modern day most Swedes and Norwegians call Central Standard Stockholmska, even though that's a somewhat misleading name. Then I had Gothia dialects, Dalmål, which is technically a Svealand dialect, but which is significantly different to the other dialects of Svealand in my opinion, the Norrland dialects, which vary a lot because Norrland is big. Then I said South Swedish, including the Scanian dialect, where it gets a little complicated because Scania was Danish for a very long time, then it was kind of an occupied Swedish colony, then it became part of Sweden and went through pretty strong assimilation into Standard Swedish, so a few people are still on the Scanian is its own language train, sometimes saying it's a Danish dialect, an East Scandinavian dialect, but for all everyday intents and purposes, there certainly is a Scanian dialect of Swedish, whether or not you think there's a separate language in there too. Then there's Gotlandic dialect, which was never going to get enough respondents to get its own group in the study sadly, but is still so different from other dialects that it can't be grouped in with anything else. This is not to be confused with Gutnish or Gutnick, the language spoken by a handful of people on the island. Gotlandic is the Gutnick-influenced Swedish dialect that most people on the island now speak. And finally, there's Finland Swedish, the dialect of Swedish spoken in Finland. Now, you may be wondering, Finland Swedish? Why would they speak the language of Sweden in Finland? Why are they speaking a Danish-influenced dialect in the capital region of Norway? Well, if you thought Denmark and Sweden were the nice, cute, peaceful countries of Europe, then you clearly haven't talked to any of their neighbours, or looked very carefully at a world map. Let's just leave it at that for now. I don't want to turn this into a history video, but I did want to address the colonial elephant in the room. Anyway, I also asked respondents whether they were a native level or fluent speaker of the language they were answering in. The difference between native and native level is just a question of identity, really. Some people have grown up in a country but maintain a distinct cultural identity may not want to call themselves native speakers of a language when they grow up with a different language at home that they feel closer to, but their grammar and so on is going to be the same as the native speakers, so you don't want to put them in fluent either. In the end, this one didn't end up mattering because there were so few fluent and native level speakers that I couldn't draw any conclusions from it. I then asked for a free-form description of the other language and free-form descriptions of the other language's dialects using the groups laid out before. Then I had a list of adjectives taken from my own conceptions, descriptions I had heard, including in the comments section of the previous video, putting the same adjectives in both surveys and making sure to include opposites of a word, so putting both formal and informal in order not to bias people in one direction too much. Then I set the words to randomize their order for every participant to eliminate any effects that might have had. Finally, I asked some questions about own perceived ability in the language, in comprehension and in speaking the language, as well as how much time the Norwegian respondents had spent in Sweden and vice versa. Then I got going with the most opportunity of all opportunity samples. My initial aim was to get 100 respondents for each language, and I put the survey on my Discord and my community tab on YouTube and spread it around to my family and friends. Unfortunately, this meant I got disproportionately many Swedes at first. I put the survey on a few subreddits, but I don't really understand how to use Reddit. I managed to pick up a couple of participants from r/Norge before my post got deleted for not being in Norwegian. My post in r/Norsk got deleted for containing a suspicious link, and then r/Norway you're not allowed to post surveys apparently. You know, I did read through the names of the rules before I posted. I just didn't realize surveys would be included under spam or self-promotion, but oh well. In r/Sweden I could post to like a thread with my survey, but r/Norway has no such option, further increasing the disparity between Swedes and Norwegians in my sample. The guy who invented K-boop knows some Norwegians as well, so I got some from there. I think I got a couple responses from r/sample size on Reddit as well, and my sample settled at 200 something Swedes and 96 Norwegians, which was very annoying. I wanted that 100. So I finally gave in and made a video on my main YouTube channel calling for participants. I went to sleep, got up in the morning, and after a few hours I unlisted the video. In the end, I then eliminated some responses that I judged were clearly duplicates, and got rid of all participants who had answered in English, because of the reasons I've already talked about, for the sake of consistency, and out of just a little bit of spite. Leaving me with 412 Norwegian speakers and 594 Swedish speakers, broken down by dialect on screen. Let's start with the which of the following words would you use question, where I broke down which were the most common words used by each group to describe the other's language. A small minority, 6 Swedish speakers and 9 Norwegian speakers, used none of these words, some of them arguing that none of these words are descriptors of a language, but for the vast majority of respondents, that clearly wasn't the case. Swedish speakers were most likely to describe Norwegian as trevligt, that is nice or pleasant, friendly, funny, and above all, with 78% of responses, as happy. In the qualitative data, that is the free answer question, I found Swedish speakers consistently describing Norwegian as happy and jovial and full of energy, with multiple responses highlighting the upwards tone that I talked about in my last video, leaving that as a likely explanation for this perception. Meanwhile, 52% of Norwegian speakers described Swedish as pleasant, making that their #1 description. Next came funny and friendly at 44% each, and then in 4th place, the one that made me want to make this video, the descriptor I kept seeing in my comment section last video, 37% of Norwegian speakers said Swedish was feminine. In the free answer question this came up a lot as well, calling Swedish a sister language to the brothers of Norwegian and Danish, saying they enjoyed listening to Swedish women but thought Swedish men just sounded ridiculous. It's worth noting that here, the dialect of the respondent didn't matter all that much. For descriptions of Swedish, pleasant was the most common or tied most common from speakers of every single Norwegian dialect. Funny and friendly were also common across the board. West Norwegian speakers were especially likely to call Swedish feminine, and South and Trøndersk speakers were especially unlikely to do that, though the sample size for the South Norwegian dialect was small. For descriptions of Norwegian, the order from 1st to 4th place in every dialect was some order of happy, funny, nice, and friendly, with Finland Swedish speakers being the only one where happy didn't take 1st place, going with funny instead and relegating happy to tied 3rd. We can also compare the percentages to each other between Swedish and Norwegian. Speakers were roughly equally likely to call each other's languages pleasant or beautiful, but Norwegians were much more likely to describe Swedish as feminine, formal, boring, and more than 10 times likely to describe it as sad, whilst Swedes were likely to describe Norwegian as silly, informal, funny, and of course, happy. In order to try and get a general idea of the impressions people had of the other language based on the quantitative data alone, I decided to give each answer the following scores, where +3 is positive, -3 is negative, 0 is neutral, and -1 is probably negative but maybe not. Then I made my girlfriend write and run some code to calculate that score for all submissions, because I don't know how to do that and she does, and got an opinion score. Now, this score is completely unscientific. On its own, it has literally no meaning. It can really only be used when comparing groups, and even when you take it and average it out between large groups, it only gives a general indication of, well, it doesn't quite give the intensity of the opinion, something closer to the likelihood that the opinion is more positive or more negative, with no 0 as well. Again, it's only relative to other entries. Still, it was a nice way to get a general idea, and it seems like more time in the country and a higher ability to understand or speak that language generally increases the opinion of the language and or likelihood that one's opinion would be positive. Now I think is a good time to mention what this kind of study is even good for. What I've done here is conduct preliminary research. It doesn't target a specific hypothesis or seek to answer a specific question. Rather, it collects a broad range of data, often, as is the case here, including qualitative data, in order to figure out if there are any questions worth asking. Basically, it's fishing for hypotheses. For instance, one thing that I'd find it interesting to target with an empirical study would be how far exposure to or ability in Norwegian changes a Swedish speaker's perception of it, or vice versa. The study I'm describing in this video, though, can't really draw conclusions. It's more designed to invite questions and to get an overview of the subject, to build sort of base assumptions and understandings to test later. So bear that in mind as we go to the free-form questions as well. A common thread in describing both languages was calling the other one zesty Swedish, or weird Norwegian. That is just an off version of one's own language, but this was more common among Swedish speakers. Norwegian speakers instead tended to call Swedish a Norwegian dialect. This occurred the other way around too, but not as much. This might be because Norwegians are already used to the more extreme dialectical differences, but the point stands that respondents constantly associated the other language with their own. Aside from this though, the respondents were across all dialects and across both groups incredibly ranged, often contradictory, sometimes seemingly self-contradictory. There is an enormous range and variation here, which in and of itself is interesting, but let's try to pick out some general trends. Swedish speakers called Norwegian easy to understand, noted the up and down melody, often in association with calling the language happy, compared the language to Danish and Icelandic, and noted archaic grammar and vocabulary, as well as calling Norwegian lazy or informal. And these were not mutually exclusive, respondents often believed both at once. Norwegian was called silly and goofy, or even ridiculous. Multiple people said they couldn't take an angry or upset Norwegian seriously. One person said it was crazy that Norwegians could speak like that when they're going to job interviews or committing bank robberies. The upward tone is also probably responsible for Swedes thinking that every sentence sounds like a question, or that Norwegians surprise themselves with everything they say. People also associated Norwegian with small magical beings like gnomes. Multiple people. Speakers from Norrland called Norwegian poetic and romantic, and better than Central Standard Swedish. People from Gothia were more likely to call Norwegian cute and associated with all the Norwegian tourists. Someone from Finland said the difference between Norwegian and Swedish felt equivalent to the difference between individual Finland-Swedish dialects, which I thought was funny. North Norwegian was identified with a great range in comprehensibility, with 8 people calling it very difficult to understand or completely incomprehensible, and 10 people calling it one of the easiest Norwegian dialects to understand. Norrland Swedish speakers were much more likely to be in the second group, which makes sense since 16 people associated North Norwegian with Norrland Swedish. It was called deeper, calmer, rounder, flatter, less silly, and less energetic. Trøndersk was compared to Norrland Swedish and to Jämtlandic. Oh, Jämtlandic. This video is already too long to get into that. Maybe another time. Trøndersk was also seen as enjoyable, funny, soft, cute, and cozy, but above all, weird. Having a weird melody, weird palatal sounds. One person said it combined all the funniest features of the other Norwegian dialects. West Norwegian was called the most Norwegian of Norwegians. Cool, dignified, less silly. 19 people said it was especially hard to understand, but a small minority of no particular dialect said it was very easy to understand, usually along with something like, in spite of what the Norwegians will tell you. It was identified with Scanian by 15 people and with Danish by 5. My guess as to why this is, especially considering that, historically speaking, West Norwegian is one of the less Danish-influenced dialects of Norwegian, is that it's purely phonological, with many respondents also identifying the reason for the similarity as being the West Norwegian dialects having the guttural R, instead of the apical R, that most Swedes and other Norwegians use. South Norwegian was grouped in much the same way and for much the same reason. Urban East Norwegian was identified as the easiest dialect to understand, with 23 people commenting on this. It was seen as funny, happy, feminine, out of it, silly, and impossible to take seriously. Swedes also noticed that most of their stereotypes about Norwegian probably came from this dialect. Non-urban East Norwegian was identified with the dialect Värmländska and called a rustic or a farmer version of urban East Norwegian. Norwegian speakers sometimes noted the less up and down nature of Swedish, but also often called it melodic and musical, especially those from North Norway. It was called pompous, arrogant, snobbish, but also elegant, aristocratic, and beautiful, and often respondents described it as both at once. I think this fine line between elegant and arrogant is probably why the Queen from Royal Teen speaks Swedish, answering the real secret research question of this study. It was called very nasal compared to French, in general called very international, with so many French and English loanwords, sometimes to the frustration of respondents, as well as the weird non-Scandinavian alphabet which makes extensive use of letters like C and X. The I sound was identified as being especially strange or silly, and Swedish was often compared to the humming of a bee. E. It's also important to note the strong cultural connotations here. Norwegians explicitly associated Swedish with Astrid Lindgren and childhood TV, leading to associations with fantasy, adventure, and storytelling, and also associated it with films and pop music. People also pointed out the weird SJ sound, with h and h. The major dialectical difference came from West Norwegian, where Swedish was seen as more sing-songy, beautiful, and, well, at least better than East Norwegian. And finally, Norwegians across the board gathered to say that Swedish is gay. It sounds like someone is doing a gay accent. How fun is that? Central Standard Swedish was described as arrogant, formal, whiny, basic, feminine, pompous, haughty, stuck up, and was associated with the upper class and with academics. It was also called cold and impersonal, and one person said it was the ugliest Swedish dialect. On the other hand, it was identified as very easy to understand, and other people called it cute and pretty, so I'm glad someone in Norway is sticking up for us. Svealand dialect was almost exclusively talked about in relation to Central Standard Swedish, similar to what happened for East Norwegian compared to Urban East Norwegian. It was called a harder to understand version of the standard and somewhat snobbish, but it was also called cozy and homely. The Gothia dialects were identified by Norwegians as the real standard of Swedish, called the closest to Norwegian, easy to understand, the most beautiful dialect, like East Norwegian but less funny, and it's here that we start to see a pattern emerge. It seems that Norwegians associate a dialect being good with how similar it is to Norwegian, in a way Swedes did not do with Swedish. This same thing goes for the Dalarna dialect, which were additionally seen as rustic, cozy, slower, monotone, and sing-songy. Again, people who identified Norrland Swedish as being like Norwegian were very likely to call it beautiful or good. It was also called slow, masculine and tough, flat, homely and charming, and associated by 9 people with the North Norwegian dialect. Finland Swedish was called the clearest Swedish, named the lingua franca of the North. It was also associated with North Norwegian and was called old-fashioned, slow, less melodic, which makes sense since Finland Swedish doesn't have any tonemes, unlike most Swedish and Norwegian dialects. Calming, soothing, cozy, and nostalgic. From my subjective point of view, it seemed like the favoured Swedish dialect of Norwegians. People also jumped in to describe the Gotland dialect as whimsical, special, and archaic, which, well, it is all those things. It's very cool. It's my favourite dialect. However, the dialect Norwegians were most interested in describing was by far South Swedish, with 36 people writing in about how Danish it is, often just writing the word dansk and nothing else. Many reported that this was the only dialect they could differentiate from other Swedish dialects, and also identified it as very difficult to understand, possibly because of the Danishness of it. It was also called the ugliest but coolest dialect, extremely funny, and associated with South and West Norwegian, presumably because of the phonology as discussed before. People had strong opinions about this dialect, that's all I can say. Overall, I find it interesting how focused on phonology responses were. When people gave reasons for the way they felt about a language or dialect, it was not always, but usually because of how it sounds. But it makes sense. I guess that's what most stands out to most people. I'd also like to note that Norwegians and Swedes loved describing a dialect in the other language as relative to a dialect in their own. You know, South Norwegian is the Scanian of Norway, so on and so forth. Finally, before the Norwegians and Swedes go off and fight each other too much, I'd like to note what we all have in common. In almost every dialect of both languages, there was someone there to say that Norwegian or Swedish was at least better than Danish. This was an enormous amount of work, so thank you to everyone who helped out, and also thank you to everyone who took part in the survey. Please put your thoughts below, I would find it interesting to see what you think. I read over all of your responses. I have improved my Norwegian significantly in this process, and I'm sorry if your opinion was not represented in the video. As I said, there was an enormous range, and at this point I just needed the video to be done, to be honest. And I mean, some of these descriptions were confusing. People said Central Standard Swedish sounds weird because it has no retroflex sounds. It does have retroflexes. We say barn and fort. And there were weird cryptic messages, like a Swede who described Norwegian as Swedish, but there is someone under the table during an interview. What does that mean? I do not understand what this means. If you're the person who wrote this, please comment down below and explain yourself.